The winter of 18 now came early that year. Snow swept over the prairie like a pale, restless sea, swallowing fences, roads, and hope in its way. In a small frontier town nestled between frozen hills, a 14-year-old boy named Eli Carter stood alone, outside the general store, with everything he owned bundled in a burlap sack. Around town, folks hardly used his name anymore. They simply called him the orphan boy. A like for his uncle had sent him away with only a few hard words. There wasn't a food to spare for one more plate. Ella didn't protest. He gathered what little belonged to him and stepped into Theckold with no destination and no one Toak beside him. That was when he spotted the old stone fort. It rose on a low ridge beyond the last line of cabins, a remnant from some long-forgotten conflict. Its roof had caved in, and weeds reached through the cracks in its walls like grasping fingers. Children dared one another to dish inside it after dark. Grown men cressetto the other side of the road to avoid it. People called it the dead pile of rocks stood inside the general store. A fatinatus hung near the counter. Abandoned fort for sale. $1. The shopkeeper chuckled when Eli gestured toward it. You don't want that place. Son, he said. Wind slices through it like a knife. You'd freeze solid before Christmas. Illa slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar. Fella's coin he had saved from chopping firewood and hauling water all summer. I'll take it, he said. The men gathered around. The stove turned their heads to stare at him. One slowly shook his head. Another let out a dry laugh. Looks like it. Boy just bought himself a tomb. Bisson down, the fort belonged to him. He pushed against the warped wooden doorin, stepped across the threshold. Cold air poured through the broken roof. Snow powdered the stone floor. Dust, damp soil, and years of rain. One wall had fallen inward, leaving a jagged opening where the wind wailed like something alive. Even so, Eli stood there and released a steady breath. It wasn't much, but it was his. Tha. He scavenged scrap boards from behind barns and hauled in a rusted iron stove someone had discarded by the road. He stacked loose stones into the wide scracks and sealed them with mud. His shins stung from the cold. His boots were soaked through, yet by midnight asmal flame flickered inside the stove, and the heavy stone walls slowly began to hold the heat. Far below, the town's lanterns shimmered like distant stars. Inside the broken fort, Eli wrapped himself in a thin blanket and listened to the wind wail across the hills. They lawed at him that night. They said he wouldn't survive the first storm. They said $1 couldn't buy a home. Buddha's dark clouds gathered from the north. Eli Carter gazed up at the rough stone ceiling and whispered, "This place will keep me alive." By the second week, everyone in town knew where Eli Carter was sleeping. They noticed Smokerling up from the old fort at dawn. They saw him walking into town with frost clinging to his coat and stone dust coating his hands. Children trailed bent him down Main Street, whispering and snickering. Grown men shook their heads as he passed. That kid's lost his wits, someone muttered outside Thessaloniki. No stove could warm that heap of rocks, another answered. Eli kept his gaze fixed ahead. Each morning, he returned to the fort carrying whatever could gather splintered boards, bent nails, scraps of tin, even an old church pew someone had thrown away. He wedged wood into the worst gaps in thewels and stuffed the openings with mudan straw. The labor was slow and unyielding. His fingers split open. His knuckles bled, but each night the wind grew fainter inside his stone shelter. Still, the cold found ways to creep in. After dark, Eli curled beside the stove with his boots tucked beneath his coat. The fire never endured for long. Bimmering, the ashes lay gray and brittle, and the stone floor bit at his feet. Some nights he dreamed of his uncle's kitchen, the scent of cornbread, the sound of a kettle humming. Other nights he dreamed he was buried beneath. One afternoon, a pack of boys trailed him up the ridge. "Hey, Fort King!" one called out. "You find any ghosts in there yet?" They tossed pebbles toward the shattered door. Wind ran off laughing. Eli remained motionless until then stepped back, incident, pulled the door shut behind him. When the first true storm struck, it terrified without warning. The sky turneth color of iron. Wind bowed the trees low and hurled snow sideways across the. By nightfall, the road into town was buried under towering drifts. Inside the fort, Eli fed the stove with his final scraps of wood and wrapped himself in every piece of cloth he owned. Wind shrieked through the broken wall like a wild beast clawing. Together, snow sifted down from the shattered roof and melted against the stone earth fire. Down in town, people pointed toward the ridge. "That boy won't make it through this one," a woman said. By morning, the storm had buried the fort up to its doorway. "'Twonders past the ridge at noon, and saw no smoke." "Guess the kid finally froze," one muttered. But inside the stone walls, Eli Cotta was still breathing. The fire had gone out before dawn, but thick rock around him had held the heat longer than would ever could. The cold crept in slowly, like an animal losing its strength. Eli woke with stiff limbs and aching hands, but he woke. He sat up and listened. No wind held inside the fort now. The snow piled outside had sealed the cracks like white mortar. The stone walls, once his curse, had turned into his shield. Ilarose brushed frost from his hair and looked around the dim interior of Theron Fort. For the first time since he voted for $1, he felt something new settle in his chest. Not fear, not loneliness, but the quiet, stubborn belief that this broken place might hold him through the winter after. After the storm, Eli Cotter began to study the fort the way a farmer studies soil. He noticed how the snow packed itself against the outer walls, sealing the cracks he had failed to. He noticed how the stone near the stove stayed warm long after the fire. Most of all, he noticed how the wind no longer ruled the inside of the fort the way it once had. So, he changed his plan. Instead of fighting the cold, he started working with it. He dug a shallow trench around the inside wall to keep melting snow from pooling on the. He stacked flat stones into a low hearth and shaped mud and clay into a purple chimney. Using an old wagon sheet and tin scraps, he patched the broken roof just enough to stop the snow from falling straight onto his bedroll. Together, they began to matter. By the third week, smoke rose from the fort in a steady, disciplined line instead of wild bursts. Eli learned how much wood to feed this stove so it wouldn't burn too fast. He learned to open and close gaps in fuel to let smoke out without letting go the heat escape. The fort no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a shelter. Food was harder. Eli set traps along the frozen creek and caught rabbits with stiff white fur. He hung meat from the ceiling beams and smoked it slowly over low fire. He boiled wild roots in an iron pot and baked flat corn cakes on hot stones. The meals were plain and meager, but they were warm, and warmth counted for Morethan taste. One afternoon, a fur trader passing through the hills saw smoke arising where no smoke should be. He climbed the ridge and knocked on Theodore. When Eli opened it, the man blinked in disbelief. "I thought this place was dead," the trader said, stamping snow from his boots. "Didn't know anyone lived up here." Eli didn't say much. He poured the man hot water and shared a strip of smoked rabbit. That trader looked around, touching the stone walls with his glove. "Feels warmer than my cabin," he said. "These rocks hold heat." That night, that trader told the story in town. By the next week, more people walked up the ridge just to see it for themselves. They stood at the doorway and stared at the patch roof, the stone hearth, the narrow sleeping space tucked behind stacked crates. Some of them laughed the some way they always had, but not as loudly. "You really living up here, boy?" one asked. "Through the winter," Eli answered. December deepened its grip in the land. The creek froze solid. The hills turned white and silent. Houses in town burned twice as much wood and still stayed cold. But inside the old fort, the stone walls absorbed the sun by day and gave it back by night. Eli worked with deliberate care now, moving slower but thinking faster. Every board had a purpose. Every fire was measured. The fort was no longer just a place he hid from the storm. It was becoming something else. Not a ruin, not a joke, but a living, breathing stronghold built, not with money or pride, but with patience, persistence, and a boy's refusal to vanish, quietly into the cold. By January, the hills around the fort were buried under drifts taller than a man. The road into town had narrowed to a single crooked path, and every chimney in the valley smoked from dawn to dark. Folks burned fence posts, broken furniture, anything that would catch fire. Even then, the cold kept winning. One night, a storm rolled in that felt heavier than the others. The sky went black before sundown, and the wind howled like it meant to scrape town clean off the map. Snow slammed against windows. Roofs groaned under through it. A barn near the river collapsed Bori midnight. Inside the fort, Eli Carter fed his stove carefully and listened to the wind beat against the stone walls. The fort did not shake. It did not groan. It simply held. Near dawn, a knock came at his door. Elefros, no one ever came up. The ridge in a storm. He opened the door and found Miss Holloway from town standing in the snow, her shawl stiff with ice. Behind her was her husband carrying their youngest child in his arms. Our stove went out, she said, voice thin with fear and the roofs leaking. Eli stepped aside without thinking. They crowded into Theffert, stamping snow from their boots. The child cried at first, then went quiet when the heat touched his cheeks. Mrs. Holloway stared at the stone walls, the glowing stove, the hanging strips of smoked meat. "How is it warmer here than in our house?" she whispered. Before the day was over, 2 more families came. A trapper with frost-beaten hands. An old man whose windows had blown out in the night. A woman whose firewood had run out before. They stood awkwardly at the doorway. The same people who when Eli bought the fort for $1. "Mind if we warm up?" one of them asked. Eli nodded and shifted his crota closer to the wall to make space. Evening, the fort was full of quiet breathing and steaming coats. Eli boiled water and shared what food. He had vein soup, made from roots and rabbit bones. No one complained. No one joked. They listened to the storm together. Went through and finally died 2 days later. The town looked battered and tired. Chimneys leaned. Doors hung crooked. Fences lay buried in snow. But the old stone fort still stood solid on its ridge, smoke rising straight into the pale sky. Word spread fast. The boys' fort stayed warm. The rocks kept the heat. He took peep line. Men who once crossed the street to avoid the place now climbed the hill to study it. They pressed their palms against the stone. They looked at Thepatruf and the narrow chimney and zooked their heads. "Smart work," one said. Eli said nothing. He just kept tending fire. That night, as the familiars went back down the ridge, Mrs. Holloway paused at the door. "Thank you," she said. "We thought you were foolish." Eli met her eyes. "So did I," he said quietly. "At first." She smiled in a way that looked like regret. From that day on, the fort was no longer called a ruin. It was called the warm place on the hill. And the boy who bought it for $1 was no longer the town's joke. He was Theon, who had built something the cold could not take. Spring came late Thatcher, slow and cautious, as if the land itself needed time to believe winter wastrelly over. The snow pulled back from the hills inch by inch. The creek began to whisper again beneath its broken ice dotted town. Doors that had stayed shut, formants finally opened, and people stepped outside like survivors of a long siege. The stone fort still stood on its ridge, dark and steady against the Pulaski. Eli Carter watched the valley wake up from the top of its wall. His hands were stronger now. His face looked older than 14. The fort behind him no longer felt like a shelter borrowed from luck. It felt earned. Every crack he had sealed, every fire he had measured, every night he had endured had turned that ruined structure into something One morning, the town council walked up the hill together. They had never done that before. "We've been talking," the storekeeper said, clearing his throat. "About that fort." Another man stepped forward. "We'd like to buy it from you. Fair price. You could build yourself a real house down in town. Eli looked at the stone walls, the narrow chimney. Theplis, where smoke had risen all winter. This is a real house. One, he said. They were quiet for a moment. Then the woman Woe had lost her firewood during the storm spoke. You saved lives up here. Eli shifted his weight. I just didn't want anyone to freeze. So instead of selling the forts, he changed it. Bismarck, travelers heading west began stopping at the ridge. Trappers, malaritas, families, pulling wagons with tired horses. They found a clean hearth, a roof that didn't leak, and a boy host for nothing but stories in return. The town started calling it Cardis, not because it was grand, but because it stood when other years later, people would say same thing about Eli himself. He had been abandoned at 14, mocked for biting a ruin, left alone with cold and stone and doubt, but he turned $1 into every— Not by magic, not by luck, by persistence, by patience, by refusing to believe that broken things could not be made useful again. Standing on the ridge at sunset, Eli watched the road wind through the valley and wondered how many people would pass that way long after Hugh was gone. How many would need shelter? How many would think of that? Winterweena Boy proved the town wrong. And now, let me ask you, what would you have donated? You were 14 and had only $1 and nowhere to go? Would you have walked away? Or would you have tried to build something with it? If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more true style frontiers, resilience, survival, and the power of one bold choice. Because of Samadi's the smallest beginning, creatus strongest shelter.